this is the thing I said in East Africa, that in East Africa, we should have become united before we became independent, before we became separate states. We should have done that. I did advocate that in 1960. I didn't even go as far as saying, realizing this, I went as far as saying Tanganyika must delay her independence, or ought to delay her independence, so that we all become united, and then we take our independence. Well, this did not happen.
Born in Tanganyika in the year 1922, Julius Nyerere was known by the Swahili name Mwalimu, or teacher, because of his profession before becoming active in politics. It was raining so hard the day Nyerere was born that he was named after an ancestral spirit who lived in the rain. He studied in Makerere University in Uganda before proceeding to Scotland for further studies. He returned to Tanganyika in 1952, and because he was a fan of Mahatma Gandhi, peace was on his mind. He advocated for non-violent demonstrations in order for Tanganyika to get its independence. Desperately wanting to see his country free, he resigned his teaching post and devoted himself to campaigning for independence. For the next several years he tirelessly toured the countryside preaching anti-colonialism without racial strife. Ever the passionate Pan-Africanist, Julius Nyerere fired several hundred British employees after independence and replaced them with Africans. Also, many Britons who had been charged with racism were evicted from the country. Julius Nyerere justified the deportations, explaining that after all, many Africans had been humiliated in their own country for many years. Nyerere believed in racial harmony. Therefore, when Idi Amin of Uganda announced the exclusion of all Asians from Uganda, Nyerere was appalled. In 1978, Ugandan troops occupied a small border area of Tanzania. Nyerere wasn't going to allow this. Idi Amin was going to fall and fall hard. In 1979, the Tanzanian army invaded Uganda in support of a local movement to overthrow Idi Amin. Nyerere intervention helped to unseat Amin, and Milton Obote returned to power in 1980. In case you didn't know, let me tell you that Nyerere was one of the founders of the OAU in 1963. He was also the driving force behind Tanganyika, Kenya, and Uganda forming the East African Community in 1967, although 10 years later, this community had collapsed. When he attended the first session of the OAU in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, he fearlessly reiterated that Africa had not yet been liberated. Nyerere broke off diplomatic relations with England in 1965 over Rhodesia and organized 5 African nations to officially oppose white minority rule in Rhodesia as well as in South Africa, Namibia, and the Portuguese colonies of Mozambique and Angola. Tanzania became the home base for nationalist freedom movements in those lands. From around 1964, Julius Nyerere began to look more keenly toward the East. The West disapproved of this closeness, but this did not move Julius Nyerere. In the years that followed, China became the major recipient of Tanzania's foreign relations. Nyerere visited China in February 1965 for an 8-day visit. His admiration of China stemmed from the fact that China had moved from an agricultural nation towards socialism, and this was very important to Nyerere. China even gave Nyerere millions of pounds in grants and loans and invested in many projects. The projects included a textile factory, a farm implement factory, and an experimental farm, and a railway that connected Zambia to the coastline and through Tanzania. Nyerere was passionate about seeing Tanzania become economically self-sufficient, and thus Ujamaa was born. How was he going to accomplish this? By harmonizing village farmlands, through free education, nationalizing banks and major industries, and keeping an eye on his political leaders to avoid wastefulness. It should also be noted that in early 1971, Tanzania passed a law that authorized the nationalization of all apartments, houses, and commercial buildings that were worth more than 100,000 Tanzania shillings. This law was meant to limit real estate exploitation, which had soared in Africa. The law further diminished the wealth of the Asian community in Tanzania, and almost 15,000 Asians left Tanzania. However, Nyerere's Ujamaa dream did not materialize as he had envisaged. The disadvantages of his dream was that agricultural production plummeted, especially sisal and cashews. Agricultural imports skyrocketed, and by 1985, nearly 85% of farmers had returned to subsistence farming. Of the companies that had been nationalized, many of them went bankrupt. But it was not all doom and gloom. Thanks to Nyerere, Tanzania has one of the highest adult literacy rates in Africa. The number of hospitals and rural health centers upped and infant mortality declined. Tanzanians possess high national pride, and there is little tribal strife. To add to that, the country remains politically stable. In conclusion, what do we say? Julius Nyerere is still today remembered as a man who was incorruptible, devoted to his country, and passionate about Africa's true independence. He was uninterested in amassing personal wealth, and maintained modest housing. In fact, his presidential salary was lower than that of his cabinet ministers. One political opponent stated, "Nyerere never sought power for power's sake. He is a real man of the people."